Welcome everyone, they call me Intro Tech and 2 videos ago I uploaded an enemy spawn template to Dreams. It has gotten a lot of support from Dreamers, but I've also seen some questions. That's why I'm now doing a tutorial on it to explain how it works and how you can use it to create wave defense games and optimized combat encounters. Let's get into it. First of all, if you're unfamiliar with it, the template I'm talking about is called ITT's Basic Enemy Spawn Template. I'll post the In Dreams link in a pinned comment. This template allows you to set up a spawn sequence for enemies to optimize frame rates or to create wave defense games. Some nice features on top of that are that I give you the option to reset the combat encounter when the player dies, and the option to endlessly repeat the last 2 waves if you're going for the wave-based thing. As always, my template is well organized and contains some text displays to explain how to use it, but I understand it's easier to understand things in video form than in text form, and on top of that I can go more in depth now. If you're looking for something specific, I'll also put timestamps in that pinned comment so you can go to a specific point in this video. Before going into examples, let's first go over how the logic works so you'll have a better understanding of what we're changing later. You activate the template by wiring something into the start fight node. When this thing gets activated, a counter will count to 1 and activate the first wave. The waves themselves consist of emitters that emit the relevant enemies. Now the wave has been spawned, a constantly on signal will be sent to the end gate of the second wave. From then on, all waves look the same logic-wise. First there is a trigger zone. This one detects the amount of enemies via tags. Don't worry, I'll go into all that later. The amount of enemies it detects output is then wired into a calculator that checks for amounts lower than 1. What this means is that the moment the current amount of enemies drops below 1, a signal will be sent. This signal is then wired into the same end gate that had a wire in it from the first wave. So now, once the current amount of enemies is below 1 and the first wave has been activated, it will start wave 2. Now if you notice, this end gate doesn't go directly into the emitter that spawns the second wave. It goes through a timer first. This one makes sure the new enemies spawn after a couple seconds instead of the exact moment the last wave was defeated. Also, if it wasn't there, everything would activate at the same time because it takes a fraction of a second to spawn the enemies. Don't worry about that though. So what happens when we activate the second wave? Well, now we send a constantly on signal to the end gate in the third wave. This one will now once again activate once it doesn't see any enemies. This process continues until every wave has been defeated. So every wave has 2 conditions that have to be met to allow them to activate. 1, the previous wave needs to be activated, and 2, the total amount of enemies in the level needs to be 0. Now what happens if we activate endless mode? Well, by toggling the switch we power on a node, which means it is now allowed to transmit signals. This node transfers a signal activated by the last wave and resets the timers of both the last one and the one before it. See what happens? The second last wave will now activate again once it sees no enemies, because its timer is empty and the previous wave still outputs an on signal. The last 2 waves will now endlessly repeat. The last thing you should know about the template is how the respawning of enemies works. It's really simple. Once again, there's a switch that determines if a node is allowed to transfer a signal. Once the player dies, you can send the signal to this node, which will then proceed to reset all timers and the first counter. This means the only way the enemies can now spawn again is if the first wave gets reactivated. The node, however, also deletes all currently active alive enemies by activating the destroyed emitted objects inputs of all the emitters. This node gets deactivated once all waves have been defeated, making sure the fight can't reset after the player has completed it. So far how it works then, now how to modify it. I'll go through 2 scenarios. But before doing that, let's place a player character and some enemies we want to spawn. I'll just use all my templates. I'll take my FPS template, zombie template, drone template and shooting enemy template and place them all down. All of them have nodes included, so we need to quickly delete all the readme/delete me chips to get rid of them. Now, the enemy spawn template works by detecting the amount of enemies via tags. These tags are not yet present in the enemies, so we'll need to add them ourselves. Let's take a tag from the logic tab and give it the name enemy with a capital E. Now place this tag in all the microchips of all the enemies we just stamped in the scene. Here's where I'll go into the 2 different scenarios. You can use the timestamps in the pinned comment to find the specific tips you're looking for. The first scenario will be an endless wave-based shooter. But instead of 7 waves where the last 2 repeat, I want 4 waves where the last 1 repeats. Let's first come up with a spawn sequence. I want the first wave to be a single zombie, the second wave to be a single drone, the third wave to be a single shooting enemy puppet, and the last wave to be all 3 enemies at the same time. To cut down on the amount of waves, we can delete the last ones or delete the middle ones, but it will always require us to rewire some logic. In the template itself I recommend to delete the middle ones, but now you hopefully understand a bit of how the template works, we can just delete the last 3 ones and make the new final wave reset itself. Remember, the only thing you need to do to repeat certain waves is to reset their timer. If we want the last 2 to endlessly repeat, we need to reset the last 2 timers. If we want the last 3 to endlessly repeat, we need to reset the last 3 timers, etc. Now that's sorted, we can start spawning enemies with the emitters. Keep in mind that if you're using my templates, which have ragdolls included, that you only spawn the alive character by scoping into their group and selecting it. I myself always ungroup my template immediately, so I have the character and ragdoll directly available. Of course, the spawn location of the enemies is also important. We usually don't want them to spawn in the player's view. A way to do this is to create doors or tunnels that enemies come out of. There's no right answer for how to do this exactly, but I would make an invisible wall that only the player can hit, deactivate everything except friend in the collide menu of a wall, and place a force applier behind it. Now when enemies spawn in the tunnel, they are forced out of it and the player can't go in. Keep in mind, this doesn't work with my enemy drone template because it isn't physical. The first 3 waves are fairly straightforward. We just make every emitter spawn their specific enemy. But once we get to wave 4, it gets interesting, because we want to spawn all 3 enemies at the same time. You can do this by grouping multiple enemies together and spawning that group, but that's really thermo intensive because even inactive groups still take up thermo. I'd recommend deleting the emitter present at wave 4 and cloning the emitters of all previous waves that will activate at the same time by wiring the timer of wave 4 into all of them. If we still want the ability to reset the device upon death, we need to use the node to activate all the destroy emitted object inputs of the emitters. To make the game start, let's connect the timer to the start fight node. Wave defense games usually start by themselves. Now all this should get it to work, so now would be a good time to start testing. Still, even though this now works, we can add some more things to make this a proper game. Let's also add a scoreboard, a game over screen, and number displayer that displays the wave we're currently in. Now the game over screen will be specifically for my template, so you might not be able to use this for your own stuff. On the logic board of the template I included the death screen microchip. Open it and deactivate the respawn timer so we can't respawn. Let's change the you died text into game over. We'll also add a wiper to the died node so the screen fades to black. Make sure to activate the transition via color option. Next we'll place a new controller sensor set to remote control and also make it activate via the node. Last we need to make sure we can restart the game if we die. Wire the X button from the controller sensor into the reset node in the spawn template and also into the respawn input from the main controller sensor of the puppet and the reset of the timer that started the game in the first place. Now we can restart the level after dying. For a normal puppet, you'd probably use the isDead output from the controller sensor to activate the same things. Of course, you could also wire the circle button into a doorway. Now you can also leave the game after dying. For the scoreboard, we can use a score and score modifier gadget. The score gadget will call wave and we can make the score modifier search for that gadget. The score modifier should be set to add, and by making the number 1, it will now add 1 number to the total amount of waves every time it's activated. Unfortunately, we can't wire the timers from the waves directly into it because they will stay on permanently, which means the score modifier won't detect new waves being activated. This is why we need to add a signal modifier set to pulse behind every timer. Those we can wire into the score modifier. We can use the died output from the player to activate the post score input of the scorer. This will post the score to the scoreboard. To display the current wave we're in, we can just place a number displayer and wire the score output into it. So far the wave defense game then. The next scenario is one I've gotten really familiar with, the combat encounter in a linear game. This one is different from the wave-based shooter in the following ways. First of all, enemies should no longer spawn while all the previous ones have been defeated. Now I want new enemies to spawn during the fight. Secondly, the combat encounter should now start when I come across it, which is of course easily done by adding a trigger zone. Thirdly, the fight should now reset upon death, allowing me to retry. Also, I now want 5 waves instead of 4, and they of course shouldn't loop endlessly. Let's get to work. We first need to add a new wave. For this we need to clone an existing one. One wave consists of a trigger zone, calculator, endgate, timer and emitter. After cloning one, we need to rewire the logic. You can use the existing logic as an example. The timer of the previous wave needs to be wired into the endgate, and the combat encounter reset node needs to be connected to the reset input of the new timer and destroy emitted objects input on the second page of the emitter's tweak menu. We also need to delete the last reset wire from the wave-based game so the fight isn't endless. Now let's decide in which order the enemies will spawn. This time will be a bit different. I now first want 3 zombies to spawn. After defeating one, I want 2 drone enemies to spawn. When there are 2 enemies left, I spawn another 2 drones and a shooting puppet. Next, when there are 3 enemies left, I spawn 2 shooting puppets, and last, when there are 2 left, I want to spawn 2 drones and 2 shooting puppets. Sounds like we will need a lot of emitters, right? Well yes, if we would do this the conventional route. What I would like to do instead is to only place a couple emitters and then reactivate them time and time again. I did this myself in some of the shooters I've made, and I'm also doing this in my upcoming Doom Eternal inspired game. With the wave defense scenario, I showed how to spawn enemies from dark tunnels. Another way to do spawning is to do it in plain sight, but with some side effects to hide the spawn itself. This is how Doom 2016 did it, and it's the approach I usually go for. For this we need to make a new microchip and add a timeline. On the timeline we'll place a fog gadget with a density of 0. Next we place a keyframe and once again set the density to 0. Then we make a second keyframe and set the density to about 25 or 30%. Using L1 plus X we can make the smoke transition from low density to high density, then pause for a moment and drop to low density again afterwards. Now we place an emitter set to emit once in the microchip and make it activate using a NOT gate in the middle of this timeline. Last thing we need to do is to add 2 nodes to the main logic board. One we will connect to the timeline, which needs to be set to once by the way. The other will connect to the destroy emitted objects input of the emitter. Because nodes add inputs to microchips, we can now easily connect it to the enemy spawn template later. For now let's clone this thing 3 times and make them all emit a specific enemy. Now clone them some more and place them around the level. Before wiring the timers into our new spawners, first place a signal manipulator set to pulse behind all of them. Right now, if we want to activate a certain spawner 2 times, the second time it wouldn't do anything because it'll still get a continuous on signal from the first wave that activated it. With those signal manipulators into place, it's time to wire them into the spawners that we want to activate. Okay, now that is done, tweak the calculators to make sure new enemies spawn during the fight and not every time a wave is completely defeated. The number we set them to should always be one higher than the actual one, because once again these calculators are set to lesser than. I'll set these calculators to all the values I mentioned earlier. Now we're almost done. One of the last things we need to do to finish this scene is to add a wire to the reset fight node. I'd use whatever wire makes your character respawn. In the case of a normal puppet, this would once again be the isDead output from the controller sensor, but in the case of my FPS template, it's the respawn timer found in the death screen microchip. Of course, now it's the X button in the death screen because I changed how the template functions while explaining the wave defense game. One last important thing remains now, and that is that we don't want the fight to reset if you die after defeating all the enemies. Wire the timer of the last into the NOT gate beneath the reset node, and that should be fixed now. Everything should work now, and unlike the wave defense scenario, I don't think much needs to be added except the checkpoint that is activated by that first trigger zone. So that about does it for my spawning template. I hope this video was of help. For now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.